How does Rehoboam's reign begin? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 2 Chronicles on Walking Through the Bible.
Of his word, the glory of his cross.
Today we're going to be discussing 2 Chronicles chapter 10, verses 1 to 11. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 10, verse 1. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 2 Chronicles chapter 10, beginning at verse 1. And Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone to Shechem to make him king. So it happened when Jeroboam the son of Nebat heard it, he was in Egypt, where he had fled from the presence of King Solomon, that Jeroboam returned from Egypt. Then they sent for him and called him. And Jeroboam and all Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father and his heavy yoke, which he put on us, and we will serve you. So he said to them, Come back to me after 3 days. And the people departed. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who stood before his father Solomon while he still lived, saying, How do you advise me to answer these people? And they spoke to him, saying, If you are kind to these people and please them, and speak good words to them, they will be your servants forever. But he rejected the advice which the elders had given him, and consulted the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him. And he said to them, What advice do you give? How should we answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, Lighten the yoke which your father put on us? Then the young men who had grown up with him spoke to him, saying, Thus you should speak to the people who have spoken to you, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us. Thus you shall say to them, My little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. And now, whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. We have now come to the transition between the reign of Solomon and the reign of his son Rehoboam. Solomon reigned over Israel for 40 years, with Israel being the most powerful that she had ever been before or since. Now, many archaeologists will protest with the Bible's portrayal of Solomon's reign being so vast as pure fiction, not supported by the archaeological evidence. But let me ask, comparing the history of man with a 40-year period of one man, would you expect to find a lot of evidence buried in the ground of his deeds, even if he was a powerful king, and especially if the land that he reigned over has seen hundreds of wars over the century by nation after nation? I wouldn't hold out much hope that such evidence still exists, but if it does, it obviously hasn't been found. But an absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, or proof that the Bible record is fabricated. It just means that we haven't found evidence other than the Bible to support what the Bible says. But again, that doesn't mean the Bible is wrong or shouldn't be believed, for it is evidence for the reign of Solomon. But with Solomon's reign coming to an end, Rehoboam became the 4th king of Israel and the 3rd king to rule over it from the Davidic dynasty. Up on the screen now is something that should look familiar to regular viewers of this podcast, for it's the timeline of the reigns of the kings of Israel and Judah. Now, the chronicler is not going to be focusing on the reigns of the kings of Israel, simply mentioning a couple kings in passing, but I'm going to keep the timeline of the kings of Israel included nonetheless, in order to establish some context as we go along. Using our key date of 966 BC as the construction of Solomon's temple, that means that Rehoboam came to the throne in about 930 BC. Upon ascension to the throne, Rehoboam chose Shechem as the city in which to be coronated king. Now, why would Rehoboam choose here? For it was not where his father was coronated, which was Jerusalem. It was not where his grandfather David was coronated, which was Hebron. And it wasn't even where King Saul was coronated, which was Gilgal. Why Shechem? Well, I don't believe Rehoboam was oblivious to the political situation he inherited when he became king, with the northern tribal unrest, especially among the tribe of Ephraim. So choosing a city within the boundaries of Ephraim and a city of importance dating all the way back to Joshua was prudent if he wished to keep the kingdom united. The map on the screen gives you the location of Shechem in relation to Jerusalem, but do keep in mind that the borders of Ephraim on this map are slightly off, as we have discussed in the past, as the city of Shechem laid within the borders of Ephraim and not within Manasseh's borders. But the choice of a coronation in the north is about the only positive gesture towards the north that Rehoboam was seemingly willing to make. For when Israel came to meet him, along with Jeroboam, who had been summoned from Egypt upon the death of Solomon, the north presented Rehoboam with an ultimatum. Lift the heavy burdens that Solomon laid on us, and we will serve you forever. Or don't, and we will not follow after your kingship. That was the very first thing spoken by the north to Rehoboam should have caused him to know immediately that the situation may be even worse than he expected, and it should have caused him to know that the proper course of action was to ease tensions, not further them along. But that's not what Rehoboam ultimately decided. For sure, Solomon's advisors, referred to here as the elders, advised Rehoboam to lighten the load and acquiesce to the demands of the north for the sake of unity. And when you think about it, the demands of the north were not unreasonable. Solomon's kingdom was quite wealthy, and that wealth wasn't with Solomon's alone, for the people prospered too. But Solomon's building projects cost money that was taxed on the people. Feeding the large court of the king meant that a further tax on vegetation produced each year was placed on the people. And then, of course, there was the upkeep of the palace and the paying of all of Solomon's staff, all of which cost a vast amount of money. These are all things that the Lord had warned Israel against when they asked for a king back in 1 Samuel 8, but it is something they said they were willing to bear, except these people were now, 120 years later, not wanting to bear that burden. But if Rehoboam would have been smart, he would have lowered the tax burden a bit on the people. Perhaps the staff could be cut as a new administration came to power. Perhaps building projects could be slowed down, or perhaps halted altogether in places they were not needed. There were numerous ways for the king to save enough money that he could have lowered taxes for the sake of unity. But no, he didn't do that. Instead, he listened to the advice of the younger men who had grown up with him, which told him to tell the north that if they hated the burdens that Solomon placed on them, then they would hate the burdens that Rehoboam would place on them even more, for they would be greater. They told him to tell the north that Solomon chastised them with whips, while he would chastise them with scourges, a scourge being a multi-thong whip meant to inflict even more pain. In short, Rehoboam was told to tell the people, "You ain't seen nothing yet." And stupidly, that's the advice that Rehoboam took. Now, why would Rehoboam heed what was obviously terrible advice? Well, there are 3 reasons, really. 2 from a human perspective and 1 from God's perspective. From the human perspective, a new leader often comes in a little headstrong, wanting to put his own stamp on the job, and yet here he is essentially being dictated to that he can't do everything that he might want to do, for a lack of money should he cut taxes. Heeding this advice might thus be seen as weakness, something undesirable if one wanted to remain king for a long time. The second reason has to do with the age of Rehoboam. In chapter 12, we're going to find out that he's 41 years old here, so he's not young, but he's not old either. And as is often the case with younger rulers, they don't like taking advice from older people, thinking that they, as younger people, know better. Young rulers do this to their detriment, as Rehoboam does here. In truth, though, verse 15 that we will cover in the next lesson says that Rehoboam heeded this advice because the events were brought about from the Lord in order to fulfill his word concerning Jeroboam, spoken by Ahijah the Shilonite. No, God didn't force Rehoboam to take advice against Rehoboam's will, but God brought about the events he did, knowing the arrogance of Rehoboam. God doesn't need to make us robots in order for his will to be accomplished. He knows our hearts too well and can bring about events that will fulfill his word, because after all, he's an all-knowing, all-powerful God. He put the heart of the leaders of the north He put it on the heart of the leaders of the north to ask for an easing of the burdens, knowing full well that the arrogance of Rehoboam wouldn't heed this request. He made sure that there were those surrounding Rehoboam that would advise him to reject the North's proposal, again of their own free will. So why did Rehoboam reject good advice and heed bad advice? So that the will of the Lord be done. Solomon had sinned, and the Lord's word concerning that punishment was now coming to pass. Rehoboam, a sinful man in his own right, was the man through whom that word was fulfilled. We'll see the response of the northern tribes, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 2 Chronicles chapter 10, verses 12 to 19, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.